I'm Mitch, 72, a former federal prosecutor who lent his name to family trust. My daughter-in-law used me, turned my dignity into a public experiment.
The tie didn't want to fit right. I adjusted it for the fourth time, looking at my reflection in the bedroom mirror. 72 was an age when a man usually forgot about social events and preferred the quiet of his own home to the noisy crowds. But today was a special day. Today, my sister-in-law Clarice was opening her plastic surgery clinic. I vividly remember when Parrish brought her to meet the family 3 years ago. The tall blonde with sharp cheekbones and attentive gray eyes gave the impression of a woman who was used to getting her way. She was 34, Parrish 37. She worked as a surgeon in a private clinic in Dallas. He worked in real estate in Mansfield. Quite a match, except for one thing. Clarice was asking too much about my past. "So you were a federal prosecutor," she said then, sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee. 28 years of service. That's impressive. Parrish smiled proudly, glancing back and forth at me and his new girlfriend. I tensed inwardly. Experience had taught me how to sense when people were interested in my career out of politeness. "Mostly routine work," I answered then. "Lots of paperwork, lots of boring stuff. But surely you still have connections, right? Colleagues who continue to work in the system?" The question sounded casual, but I sensed something more than curiosity in it. Clarice was studying me as carefully as a surgeon studies a patient before an operation. I could read professional curiosity in her gaze, as if she were mentally mapping out my capabilities and connections. "There is someone," I answered evasively, not wanting to let the stranger in on the details of my past. But Clarice was persistent. During that first visit, she'd managed to find out that I knew federal judges in the Northern District of Texas, had relationships with former colleagues from the FBI and IRS, and had acquaintances among Mansfield's urban elite. She got all this out of me discreetly, between questions as if she just wanted to get to know her boyfriend's family better. Parrish was delighted by her interest in our family. My son had always had a certain naivete about women. At 37, he still believed in romantic love and sincere involvement. Clarice quickly realized this and skillfully played on his feelings. I watched their relationship with growing concern. Not that I did not like Clarice as a woman. She was intelligent, educated, beautiful. But there was something calculated about her, as if every gesture, every word had been pre-planned. When she laughed at Parrish's jokes, I noticed how her eyes remained cold. When she expressed her admiration for our home, our family traditions, the history of the Dunhill family, her voice had the intonation of a man evaluating merchandise in a store. They married 6 months later, a modest one, in a small circle. Clarice insisted that the ceremony be held in Mansfield, not in Dallas, where her family lived. At the time, I thought she wanted to show respect for her new family. Now I understand she needed to establish herself in her new territory to signal her presence in the city where she planned to build her career. After the wedding, Clarice left her high-paying job in Dallas and took a job at a local hospital. The pay was considerably less, but as she explained to Parrish, she wanted to be closer to her husband. Parrish melted at such devotion. I kept quiet, though I noticed how quickly my daughter-in-law was networking with the local elite. The first thing she did was join the Businessmen's Wives Club, an organization that in Mansfield was considered the gateway to high society. Then she started attending all the charity events where judges, lawyers, doctors, anyone who carried weight in the town appeared. Clarice possessed a rare talent. She knew how to listen. She didn't talk much at parties, but she absorbed information carefully, memorizing names, connections, weaknesses. I watched her at these events and marveled at her methodical nature. Clarice never imposed, never asked questions. But by the end of the evening, she knew more about everyone present than many locals who had lived in the city all their lives. She memorized who was friends with whom, who couldn't stand whom, who had what ambitions and problems. "Your wife is very sociable," I once said to Parrish as we sat on the veranda, drinking beer after another family dinner. "Certainly, yes, she is easy to get along with people," my son replied, not noticing the caution in my voice. "She says she wants to integrate into our community." I didn't say anything at the time. Integrate was a word Clarice used often, as if she was a foreigner learning a new culture, when in fact she was studying the local ecosystem of power and influence with the precision of an entomologist dissecting an insect. A year after the wedding, Clarice began to talk about her own practice, cautiously at first, as if reflecting aloud over family dinners that became regular after she moved to Mansfield. "There's no good plastic surgeon in Mansfield," she remarked as she cut up a chicken. "People have to go to Dallas or Houston." "Don't you have enough work at the hospital?" I asked, sensing a catch. "Of course I do, but it's mostly reconstructive surgery, trauma, birth defects, and cosmetic surgery. This is a completely different direction, more lucrative." Pirish was instantly enamored with the idea. He began researching the possibilities, looking for premises, consulting bankers for a loan. Clarice was supportive of his enthusiasm, but I noticed how cleverly she steered the conversation in the right direction. "Of course, reputation is everything in a case like this," she said, stirring the sugar in her coffee with slow, deliberate movements. "Clients have to trust the doctor, and trust comes not only from professional skills, but also from, let's say, social status." I realized then what she was getting at. The name Dunhill meant something in Mansfield. 30 years of service in the prosecutor's office, an impeccable reputation, respect in the community. It was all working for Clarice now. She hadn't just married my son, she had acquired a brand. She began introducing herself as Clarice Dunhill Holmes, emphasizing the connection to her husband's family. The business cards she ordered before the clinic opened read, "Dr. Clarice Dunhill Holmes, plastic surgeon, a tradition of quality and trust." Sounds nice, doesn't it?" she asked, showing me the card. "Very much so," I replied dryly. Pirish didn't notice the irony in my voice. He was too busy planning and dreaming about the family business. Clarice gently fueled his ambitions by talking about how in the future he could take care of the administrative part and she could take care of the medical part. The son saw this project as the fulfillment of their shared dreams. He did not realize that he was only a convenient bridge between his wife and her true goals. "We will create something really meaningful," she said, and her eyes lit up with a special sparkle. "A clinic that will be associated with the highest standards." Dunhill family standards, I realized mentally. 6 months before the opening, Clarice asked me for a small favor out of the blue. She came into my office on an evening when Pirish was at work and paced around for a long time before getting to the point. "You know, I'm researching new techniques," she finally said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Non-invasive rejuvenation procedures. But before we can offer them to clients, we need to make sure they're effective." "And what do you offer?" I asked, even though I already had an idea. I could try some of the treatments on you. Completely free of charge, of course. A slight lift, injections, skin texture improvement. Nothing drastic." I wanted to say no right away, but then I thought of Paresh. My son was so enthusiastic about the family business that refusing to participate in it could upset our already tenuous relationship. Besides, curiosity got the better of me. I wondered how far Clarice would be willing to go to use the family resources. "Okay," I agreed, "but only if it's really safe." "Of course," she exclaimed enthusiastically. "All procedures are fully certified." For the next 2 months, I regularly visited Clarice's makeshift office, which she had set up in one of the rooms of our house. There she practiced various techniques on me. Botox injections, fillers, laser treatments. She documented each session in detail, photographed the results from different angles, a real scientific work. "The results are amazing," she said as she looked at the next series of photos. "You look 10 years younger." I didn't see much difference myself, but Pirish and his wife were delighted. My son told everyone he knew about Clarice's professionalism, citing me as living proof of her skill. In the meantime, Clarice had compiled a detailed portfolio with before and after photos, which she planned to use for advertising purposes. "Only with your permission, of course," she added, as if in between. "Although you must agree that such a result is the best advertisement for the clinic." I agreed, not fully realizing at the time what I was getting into. Clarice was pleased. She got not only quality publicity material, but also the opportunity to hone her skills before opening her own practice. Gradually, I began to realize that my role in this project was much more important than it might seem. Clarice wasn't just practicing on me. She was creating a success story. A person with my reputation who agreed to the procedures automatically became a guarantor of their quality and safety. Who would doubt a doctor's professionalism if her patient was a former federal prosecutor? A few weeks before the grand opening, my sister-in-law showed me the plan for the event. Everything had been thought out to the last detail. A tour of the clinic, a presentation of services, a buffet in a spacious hall. She invited all the important people of the city, from the mayor to the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, from the head doctor of the hospital to the owners of the largest enterprises. And of course, I plan to introduce you to the guests, she said, showing me the guest list. As someone who helped me refine my techniques. How? I clarified. Well, I'll tell you how you generously agreed to be my first patient. Show you the results. That would be very convincing. I didn't pay much attention to what she said at the time. I thought it was just an ordinary presentation where I'd be mentioned among those who'd supported the project. I didn't realize that Clarice was preparing a special role for me in her show. Now standing in front of the mirror and adjusting my tie, I was thinking about how I had imperceptibly become a promotional tool for my sister-in-law's ambitions. Clarice had gained not only a respectable family name and social connections, but also living proof of her professional skills. Moreover, she had gained an ally in the person of my son, who sincerely believed in their common cause. I looked at my watch. The grand opening was starting in an hour. I knew Clarice was more excited than she was showing. Yesterday, I'd seen her checking the guest list for the umpteenth time, rehearsing her speech, calling buffet vendors. For her, this event was not just a celebration of the clinic's opening, but her debut as a serious player in the Mansfield medical market. Parrish was nervous too, though he tried not to show it. He called twice in the morning, asking what time I'd be there, if I needed help getting there, if my suit was okay. My son always took things personally, and today was especially important to him. I grabbed my car keys off the dresser and headed for the exit. I stopped in the hallway, glancing at the family photos hanging on the wall. Parrish as a child, my late wife and I at our wedding, his graduation from university, and a new picture, his and Clarissa's wedding. She's standing next to him in a white dress, smiling at the photographer, but her eyes are looking somewhere off to the side, as if she's already planning her next move. I shut the door of the house and get in the car. The drive to the clinic would take 20 minutes. 20 minutes to finally prepare myself for the role Clarice had devised for me. I started the engine and drove slowly out of the driveway, thinking about what awaited me today. The parking lot in front of the clinic was packed with cars. I parked in the far corner, next to the blue sedan of Judge Coleman, whom I knew from general cases back in the 80s. Getting out of the car, I looked around the building Clarice had rented for her project. The two-story red brick structure had once belonged to a dental clinic, but it had been completely remodeled in the last 6 months. It now looked modern and expensive, exactly the impression my sister-in-law was striving for. The wide glass doors were adorned with a polished steel sign that read, Dr. Dunhill Holmes Center for Aesthetic Medicine. Even in the name, she'd managed to emphasize the connection to our family by putting her husband's last name first. I entered the spacious lobby, where about 50 people were already gathered. The interior was striking in its thoughtfulness. Marble floors, sand-colored leather chairs, abstract paintings in thin frames. Everything was in a beige and gold color scheme, which created the feeling of an expensive spa resort, not a medical institution. Muted classical music, the unobtrusive scent of lavender. Clarice didn't miss a single detail that could impress potential clients. She stood in the center of the lobby, surrounded by a group of women from the local high society. She wore a dark blue dress that emphasized her figure, but was strict enough for a professional event. Her hair was styled in an elegant bun, her makeup was flawless, and her smile never left her lips. My sister-in-law was in her element. "Mitch," she exclaimed when she saw me. "You're here!" She walked over and kissed me on the cheek, the way a loving daughter-in-law should greet her father-in-law. But I sensed something theatrical in the gesture, as if she were acting out a scene for others. "Ladies, I'd like you to meet Mitch Dunhill," Clarice said, turning to her companions. "My husband's father. The former federal prosecutor I told you about." The women perked up. Among them I recognized Jessica Randolph, wife of the owner of the city's largest construction company, Cynthia Blake, wife of the hospital's chief heart surgeon, and several other powerful ladies whose husbands shaped Mansfield's economic and political life. Nice to meet you, Mr. Dunhill, Jessica said, extending her hand. Clarice has told me so much about your family. Only good things, I hope, I replied, smiling slightly. Oh, of course, Clarice intervened. Mitch has been a real mentor to me on this project, supported me every step of the way. I gave her a quick glance. Mentor? Supportive? It was a stretch, but the women were catching every word she said. Now, if you'll excuse me, ladies, Clarice continued, but I need to talk to Mitch about some details of today's presentation. She took me under her arm and led me aside toward a window where it was quieter. Thank you for coming, she said in a quieter voice. Today is a very important day. I had noticed, the scope is impressive. This is just the beginning. See that man in the gray suit? She discreetly nodded toward a tall brunette in his mid-40s. Dr. Richardson from Dallas. He owns a chain of plastic surgery clinics. If he cooperates, I can get access to his client base. I followed her gaze and saw Dr. Richardson scrutinizing the information boards with before and after photos. Among those photos were mine, although my face was obscured by a privacy strip. And the woman next to him is Gloria Freeman, editor of Texas Lifestyle magazine, Clarice continued. If she wrote an article about the clinic, it would be worth thousands of dollars in advertising. I watched my sister-in-law mentally catalog each guest, determining their value to her plans. There was tension in her eyes, but also the excitement of a hunter who sees prey within reach. Mitch, I'm going to start the formal part in half an hour, she said, lowering her voice. I'm going to talk about the techniques, show you the results of the work. And I'd like to introduce you as as someone who trusted me with his face. It'll make a strong impression. You know, if a former federal prosecutor agrees to a procedure, it means he has complete confidence in the doctor's professionalism. I remained silent, pondering her words. Of course I did. My reputation was a trump card she was about to play in front of her most important audience. Okay, I said finally, but only in general terms. Of course, no personal details. At that moment, Parrish approached us. My son looked worried but pleased. He was wearing a new dark suit, navy tie, clearly Clarice's choice. Dad, how did you like the clinic? He asked, hugging me. Impressive, I answered honestly. Clarice has worked so hard on this project. Every detail has been thought out. I looked at my son and saw genuine pride in his eyes. Parrish truly believed that he and his wife were creating something significant. For him, this was not a cynical business project. He saw the clinic as the realization of their family dream. Parrish, darling, Clarice put her hand on her husband's shoulder, could you check if everything is all right with the buffet? I'm worried that not enough oysters were brought in. Some. Of course, he kissed her cheek and headed towards the appetizer tables. Clarice gave him a glance, and I noticed the instantaneous change in her expression. The soft smile was gone, replaced by the focused expression of a businesswoman. He's a good man, she said, as if reading my mind. Yes, he is, I agreed. And he deserves to succeed. We both do. There was a note of challenge in her voice, as if she expected me to object. But I remained silent. Instead, I watched her interact with the guests. Clarice moved around the room with the grace of a seasoned diplomat. She had a different approach with each person. With Judge Coleman, she talked about the importance of an impeccable reputation in the profession. With the wives of businessmen, about the need to look appropriate to their status. With a journalist, about innovative techniques and European experience. I noticed how she dosed information. With some, she was open and friendly. With others, she was more reserved and professional. Each conversation was designed to achieve a specific goal, to get a recommendation, to agree on cooperation, to interest a potential client. Mr. Dunhill? I was approached by a middle-aged stranger. Tony Marchetti, attorney at law. I work in corporate law. We shook hands. Marchetti looked like a man who was used to money and power. Clarice tells me that you helped her in the preparation phase of the clinic, he continued. In a way, I answered cautiously. Modesty, I understand. But you must agree that your participation in the project is a serious recommendation. Everyone in our circles knows your reputation. I understood where he was going with this. Marchetti was studying me as carefully as a potential client studies a product. My connection to the project was an indicator to him of reliability and quality. I was impressed with Dr. Dunhill Holmes as a top-notch professional, I said diplomatically. Good. My wife has already made an appointment for a consultation. She's been wanting to do something with, he waved his hand uncertainly. You know, age-related changes. After half an hour, Clarice asked for attention and began the formal part of the event. She led the guests through the clinic, showing the operating room with modern equipment, the consultation rooms, the recovery area. Everything was organized like a perfectly directed performance. At the end of the tour, we returned to the main lobby where Clarissa began her presentation of her techniques. She spoke about minimally invasive procedures, innovative technologies, individual approach to each patient. Her speech was professional and convincing. And now I want to show you the concrete results of our work, she said, turning on the projector. Photos before and after various procedures appeared on the screen. The faces were hidden by strips to maintain privacy, but the results really looked impressive. These are examples of work with patients of different age groups, Clarice continued. From 30 to 75 years old. I recognized my pictures among the others. To be honest, the difference was noticeable, though not as dramatic as Clarice had imagined. I'm especially proud of this one. She lingered on my pictures. A 72-year-old patient who underwent a comprehensive rejuvenation procedure. As you can see, the result is excellent. Several people in the room murmured approvingly. I felt eyes on me. Some of the guests were obviously trying to figure out who could be this mysterious patient. Clarice finished her presentation to a round of applause and motioned for the guests to move on to the buffet. I watched as she accepted congratulations, exchanged contacts, made appointments. Her plan was working. People were impressed with what they saw and willing to trust her with their appearance. Mitch. She approached me again as the crowd dispersed a bit. Thank you. It went exactly as I had planned. I nodded but didn't respond. Instead, I continued to watch my sister-in-law work the audience, using every minute to promote her interests. The buffet was in full swing when Clarice asked for attention a second time. She gracefully tapped the champagne glass with her spoon, and the chatter in the room gradually died down. The guests turned to her, holding plates of delicacies and glasses of drinks. I stood at the window, sipping mineral water, and watched my sister-in-law prepare for the next part of her performance. Dear friends, she began, and her voice sounded warm and trusting. Before we continue our fellowship, I would like to share a little story with you. The story of how this project was born and who helped me in its realization. She paused, looking around at the audience. Her eyes stopped on me, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. Something in her tone made me wary. When I first started learning new aesthetic medicine techniques, I was faced with the question, how could I be sure that the procedures were effective and safe? Like any responsible doctor, I couldn't offer patients something I wasn't absolutely sure of. The guests listened attentively. Clarice had a knack for capturing the audience's attention, and now she was clearly preparing for something important. And then I had an unexpected stroke of luck. There was a man in our family who generously agreed to help, a person whose trust is valuable, whose reputation is impeccable, whose decision could be the best recommendation for any doctor. She turned in my direction, and all eyes followed her. I felt myself blush under the attention, though I didn't yet understand where she was going with it. Soronotonomy. Meet, Clarice continued, extending her hand in my direction. This is Mitch Dunhill, my father-in-law, a former federal prosecutor with 30 years of experience, and my first lab rat. The last words were light, almost playful, accompanied by a melodic laugh. But to me, they hit me like a slap in the face. A lab rat? Did she really say that out loud in front of all those people? The guests laughed, taking her words as a cute family joke. Some even applauded. But I stood there numb with surprise and humiliation. Clarice continued to smile, as if not noticing my reaction. Mitch was brave enough to agree to try all the treatments I had planned to include in the clinic's lineup of services. She continued, injections, laser treatments, facelifts. He became my living training manual. The laughter in the room grew louder. I could see people looking over, some with admiration, some with surprise. Judge Coleman shook his head, clearly impressed with my courage. Jessica Randolph looked at me with renewed interest, as if I had suddenly become a much more interesting person. And the result, as you can see from the pictures, has been beyond your expectations. Clarice gestured to the screen where the before and after images still hung. Mitch looks amazing. Don't you think so, honey? She looked at me expectantly, and I realized I had to say something. Everyone was waiting for my reaction. I tried to smile, but I felt my facial muscles tense and stiff. Clarice is really a professional, I squeezed out of myself. Oh, he's being modest, exclaimed my sister-in-law. In fact, Mitch was the perfect patient. Patient, trusting. He let me experiment, try different dosages, compare the effects of different drugs. Thanks to him, I was able to perfect my technique. To experiment, try different dosages, compare the effects. Every word she said was a blow to my ego. She talked about me like I was a lab animal on which she was practicing her skills, and she did it with such ease, as if it were perfectly normal. And best of all, Clarice continued, Mitch agreed to let me use his pictures in my promotional materials. Isn't that the ultimate in trusting a doctor? Dr. Richardson from Dallas nodded with approval. Gloria Freeman was writing something down in her notebook. Tony Marchetti looked at me with unconcealed admiration. They all saw this story as a wonderful example of family support and professional excellence. No one noticed the humiliation I was experiencing. Of course, Clarice added with a joking tone. I promised him that if anything went wrong, I would give him back his old face. Fortunately, no such need arose. The hall laughed again. I saw Parrish smiling proudly, looking at me and at his wife. It was a touching moment of family unity for him. He didn't realize that his wife had just publicly humiliated his father. So when you see the results of our clinic, Clarice concluded, remember that behind each one is not only professional skill, but also personal responsibility. I will never offer a patient something that I am not ready to experience on my own loved ones. The applause was loud and prolonged. Several people came up to me to shake hands and express admiration for my courage. I mechanically responded to their compliments, but inside I was seething with rage. Mitch, you look great, Cynthia Blake said to me. My husband would do well to follow your example. Really impressive results, added a man I didn't know. You've lost 10 years, no less. I nodded, smiled, said something appropriate, but my thoughts were far from small talk. I was thinking about how Clarice had called me a lab rat, how lightly, almost carelessly, she had said those words, as if it was a matter of course. Dad, are you okay? Parrish came up to me as the crowd around me thinned a little. Yeah, I'm fine, I answered, trying to control my voice. Clarice spoke so movingly of you. I'm proud of you for supporting our project. Our project. He still didn't realize that the project was Clarice's alone, and that he and I were just tools to make it happen. She's good, I told my son. Parrish glowed with pride. He put his arm around my shoulders and led me toward the group of people he wanted me to meet. I walked beside him, still playing the role of a satisfied father-in-law, but inside something irrevocably changed. I spent the rest of the event in a state of inner tension. I smiled when I should have smiled, answered questions when I was asked something, but my thoughts were occupied with one thing. Clarice's words. She wasn't just using me to accomplish her goals. She humiliated me publicly, and she did it so cleverly that no one even noticed the humiliation. Clarice, meanwhile, continued to work with the guests. She wrote down phone numbers, scheduled consultations, and discussed opportunities for collaboration. Her face was glowing with pleasure. The evening was clearly going exactly as she had planned. Every few minutes, she cast appreciative glances in my direction, as if I were part of her triumph. Mitch, she approached me near the end of the event. Thank you so much. Your participation in the presentation was invaluable. You're welcome, I replied dryly. If she noticed the coldness in my tone, she didn't show it. On the contrary, she looked enthusiastic and happy. Shonam, I got 7 requests for counseling today, she shared, and that's just on the first night. Dr. Richardson has offered to collaborate. Gloria Freeman wants to do an interview for her magazine. I didn't even expect such a success. Success achieved also at the expense of my humiliation, I thought, but said nothing out loud. Parrish should be happy, I remarked. Oh yes, he's in 7th heaven. You should have seen his face when I told him about your participation in the project. He was so proud of you and me. Proud. Yeah, my son was really proud of his father for letting himself become a lab rat for the family business. What he didn't realize was that he was witnessing not a touching family unity, but a cynical exploitation of kinship ties. By 10 p.m., the event had come to an end. The guests were leaving, exchanging last impressions and contacts. I said goodbye to Pirish and Clarice, promising to visit them soon, and headed to my car. Sitting behind the wheel, I didn't start the engine for a few minutes, just staring at the lighted windows of the clinic. The lights were still on inside. Clarice was probably organizing the paperwork and summarizing the evening. She had accomplished her goal. The clinic had been successfully opened. The first clients had signed up, and connections had been made. And much of the credit for that success belonged to me, the man she had publicly labeled a lab rat. I started the engine and drove slowly out of the parking lot. The drive home took the same 20 minutes, but in that time I made a decision that would change everything that followed. At home, I poured myself a whiskey and sat in the living room chair without turning on the light. Moonlight streamed through the windows, creating bizarre shadows on the walls. I held the glass in my hands and replayed Clarice's words over and over in my head. 30 years in the prosecutor's office had taught me to analyze people's behavior, to understand their motives, to see what was hidden behind words and gestures. Today I realized that all these months I had been mistaken about my sister-in-law. I thought she was just using our family ties to advance her career. It turned out to be much worse than that. To her, I was not a relative to be used, but a guinea pig to be experimented on. A lab rat. Those words stung more than any insult. There was such blatant cynicism in them, such disdain, that I still couldn't believe what I'd heard. But the most painful part was that she'd said it publicly, in front of all those people, making my humiliation part of her show. I finished the whiskey and went into the kitchen to pour another. Standing at the window, I looked out at the lights of the city and thought about how cleverly Clarice had planned the whole thing. She hadn't just called me a lab rat, she'd done it in a context that made the audience take her words as a compliment. My courage, my generosity, my trustworthiness all sounded fine until you remember the very words she used to characterize me. The phone rang around midnight. It was Pirish calling. "Daddy, I'm sorry I'm so late," he said, and you could hear the excitement in his voice. I couldn't help but call. "It was a great night tonight." "Yes, very impressive," I replied. "Clarice can't get enough of it. She says she never expected it to be such a success, not even in her wildest dreams. And you know what touched her the most? The way you supported her. When she talked about how you helped her practice the procedures, she had tears in her eyes. Tears in her eyes, of course she did. Clarice could play any role, evoke any emotion when it suited her purposes. Isham, she said it wouldn't have worked without you," Pierce continued, "that you were not just a patient, but a true partner in this project." A partner. That's an interesting interpretation. "I'm glad it went well," I told my son. "Dad, you sound a little, tired. Is everything okay?" "It's just a long day, and I'm not used to this kind of event." "I understand. Get some rest. And thanks again for everything. I know it wasn't easy for you." After Parish hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, thinking about his words. My son was happy. He saw today's event as a triumph of family unity, the realization of his and Clarice's shared dreams. What he didn't realize was that he had witnessed his wife publicly humiliate his father. Around 1 a.m., I went up to my office and pulled out an old notebook. In it were the phone numbers of colleagues I had worked with in the prosecutor's office and other federal agencies. Many had already retired like me, but some were still serving. I flipped through the pages, remembering faces, cases we'd investigated together. My gaze stopped on John Harris's license plate. We'd worked together in the 90s, investigating tax violations and healthcare fraud. John was 5 years younger than me and was still working for the IRS, even though he was about to retire. We kept in touch, meeting occasionally for lunch, exchanging news about former colleagues. That morning at 9:30, I dialed John's number. He answered almost immediately. "Mitch, what a surprise. What's up, buddy?" "Hello, John. I'm good. Listen, could you check something out for me?" Unofficially between old friends. "Sure. What's up?" "There's a new plastic surgery clinic opening up in Mansfield. Dr. Dunhill Holmes Center for Aesthetic Medicine. I'm concerned about the paperwork and licensing." John was quiet for a few seconds. Dunhill Homes? That wouldn't happen to be a relative, would it? Sister-in-law. But it's not about family ties. It's just that there are some, doubts about the integrity of the business. I see. What kind of doubts? I hesitated for a moment, searching for words. I didn't want to look like a vindictive old man taking revenge on his daughter-in-law for a personal offense, but I couldn't keep quiet any longer. Maybe there were irregularities in the tax records. Maybe licensing problems with certain procedures. It's hard to be specific, but my gut tells me it's not clean. Mitch Dunhill's intuition is worth a lot, John said with a chuckle in his voice. I remember when you could smell trouble a mile away. All right, I'll look into the paperwork, but I can't order a formal inspection. I need a good reason. I understand. Just see if there are any obvious irregularities. Will do. Give me a couple of days. After talking to John, I felt a little relieved. Not that I was planning revenge, I just wanted to make sure everything was in order. If Clarice is doing business honestly, there won't be a problem. And if she wasn't, well, then justice would be served. I spent the rest of the day at home, reading, working in the garden, trying to get my mind off last night. But Clarice's words kept me awake. I thought about how she had planned her speech, how she had calculated the effect of each phrase. The lab rat wasn't a casual remark or a bad joke. It was a deliberate humiliation that she served up so deftly that no one noticed the insult. John called back the next day, Thursday, around noon. Mitch, your intuition didn't fail you, he said without preamble. There are indeed questions there. What kind of questions? Several points. First, not all of the treatments the clinic offers are licensed. Some drugs, judging by the documents, are not certified for cosmetic use. Secondly, there are suspicions of underreporting of income on tax returns. Seriously? Serious enough to interest the relevant services. I've already talked to the FBI guys who specialize in medical fraud. They're planning a visit to your sister-in-law tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, that would be Friday. I felt mixed emotions. Satisfaction that my intuition was right and some anxiety for Pirish. My son will be shocked when he finds out about the problems. Thank you, John. I appreciate your help. You're welcome. By the way, how did you know there was something wrong? I paused for a moment, contemplating an answer. Professional intuition and a knowledge of human character. Got it. Well, we'll see what the test shows. Friday morning, I woke up earlier than usual and couldn't bring myself to get out of bed for a long time. Somewhere about now, at this very time, FBI agents are walking into Clarice's clinic with paperwork for the background check. She probably doesn't realize the seriousness of the situation yet, thinking it's a routine inspection that can be solved with a couple of phone calls to the right people. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, Parrish called. He sounded worried. Dad, we have a problem. FBI agents have been at Clarice's clinic since this morning. They're checking all the records, sealing off some of the offices. What's going on? I asked, trying to make my voice sound concerned but not surprised. I don't know exactly. Clarice says it's some kind of mistake, a misunderstanding, but the agents are acting very seriously. They've been sitting there for 3 hours now. Could this really be a routine check? Doesn't look like it. They came in with warrants, brought in specialists. Clarice tried to call her lawyer, but he's on vacation. I sympathized and promised to come by if I needed help. After talking to my son, I sat back in my chair and tried to analyze my feelings. Satisfaction? Yes, absolutely. Justice? Likewise. Regret? Probably not. Clarice chose this path when she thought she could humiliate people with impunity to achieve her goals. Pirish called again 2 hours later. I could hear the panic rising in his voice. Dad, it's getting worse. The agents have taken away boxes of documents. Clarice says they're asking about drug licenses and tax returns from last year. She's completely confused. Where are you now? At the clinic. I got here as soon as Clarice called. The agents just left, but they said they'd be back Monday with more questions. I heard a woman crying in the background. Clarissa apparently couldn't contain his emotions any longer. Maybe I should come over, I suggested, realizing I had to play the role of caring father-in-law. Yes, please. Clarice isn't thinking straight right now. Half an hour later, I was at the clinic. The picture I saw was strikingly different from what I had seen 2 days ago during the grand opening. Instead of elegantly dressed guests with glasses of champagne, my son and Clarice sat in the spacious hallway, surrounded by a chaos of scattered papers. Several offices were sealed with yellow tape. Folders of documents that the agents hadn't had time to pick up were lying on the reception desk. Clarice looked completely different than she had on opening day. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared with tears, her expensive dress wrinkled. She was thrashing around the hall, frantically clutching her cell phone in her hands and saying something quickly into the receiver. "No, it's impossible," she shouted into the phone. "I demand an explanation. Who gave you the right to barge into my clinic and rule here?" She saw me and cut me off. "Mitch," she came running toward me. "This is a nightmare. It's a nightmare. I don't know what's going on." There was panic in her eyes, but not remorse. Clarice was outraged, not frightened. She saw what was happening as an injustice directed against her personally. "Someone wanted to destroy me," she continued frantically. "Someone had sicked the feds on me on purpose." Parrish sat in his chair, holding his head in his hands. My son looked depressed and confused. "Clarice, why don't you calm down first?" he said tiredly. "Calm down?" she blurted out. "When my reputation is going to hell and the clinic could be shut down? Do you have any idea what that means?" She started pacing the room again, waving her arms. "Someone at the opening was trying to hurt me," she said, clearly speaking more to herself than to us. "Someone was jealous of my success and decided to make a pig's ass of it." I watched her hysterics with outward calm, but inside I felt satisfaction. Clarice was thrashing around looking for the enemy, unaware that he was sitting next to her. Could it be Dr. Richardson from Dallas? She pondered aloud. He was asking suspiciously many questions about my techniques. What if he wasn't coming to cooperate, but to learn secrets and then set me up? "Clarice, you are beginning to see conspiracies everywhere," said Parrish. "What else can I do?" she snapped at him. "The feds don't just show up. Somebody pointed them in their direction." She grabbed her notebook and began frantically scrolling through the entries. "Look," she said to her husband, "here's a list of everyone who was at the opening. Which of them might have had a motive?" I watched her study each name, trying to find a potential traitor. Her fingers trembled with nervous tension. George Campbell from the city administration. He was asking about licenses. Marlene Grace, Judge Coleman's wife, too interested in drug suppliers. And that reporter, Gloria Freeman, maybe she was digging for an expose? "Do you seriously think a judge's wife would be a whistleblower?" Parrish asked skeptically. "Why wouldn't she?" Clarice turned to her husband with burning eyes. "Maybe her husband advised her to look into my cases. Judges are good with laws." Parrish shook his head, but remained silent. I could see that he was tired of his wife's tantrums, but he continued to support her. "Could it be someone from Dallas?" Clarice continued to ponder. "Dr. Stevenson always disliked me. He could have hired a private investigator to find dirt." She grasped at one theory after another, discarded them, and made up new ones. There was no logic in her behavior, only panic and a desire to find an external enemy. "Or Roberta Jones," she exclaimed suddenly. "That nurse from the hospital who had reacted so painfully to my leaving? She could have made something up, made up stories." "Clarice," Parrish said tiredly, "the nurse from the hospital has no access to information about your private practice." "How do you know?" she snapped at him. "These people have connections everywhere. Maybe she knows someone at the IRS or the licensing board." She picked up the phone again, dialing someone's number. "Hello, Martha. It's Clarice. Tell me honestly, have you talked to anyone about my clinic?" "No." "Did you talk to anyone from the federal government?" "What do you mean? What do I care?" "I care because I had a visit from FBI agents this morning." The conversation was brief. She was clearly unwilling to discuss the subject. Clarissa threw the phone on the table. "Everyone pretends to be innocent sheep," she said bitterly. "But some of them are lying." I remained silent as I watched my sister-in-law try to find a scapegoat for her problems. She was ready to suspect anyone, competitors, former colleagues, casual acquaintances, just not to admit that she herself might have committed serious violations. Maybe we should focus on what the agents were specifically interested in, I finally suggested. Poisson, what was of interest? Clarice turned to me. Everything. Licenses, drugs, taxes, bank accounts. They went through the files for 4 hours. And what did they find? Clarice was silent for a moment, obviously thinking about the answer. Nothing that would interest them, she said at last. Maybe some minor inconsistencies in the layout, but nothing more than that. I knew she was lying, or at best, understating things. FBI agents don't spend all day looking for minor inconsistencies in the layout. What kind of inconsistencies? I insisted. Clarice began nervously rubbing her hair. Some of the drugs, she began uncertainly. Perhaps not all of them have the full package of American certifications. But they are perfectly safe. I've been using them for years. Is everything all right with taxes? Of course they are. She burst into flames. I run an honest business. But I notice how she avoids a direct look when she talks about taxes. Another sign that not everything is as clean as she claims. You know what pisses me off the most? Clarice said, pacing the room again. The opening went great. Everyone was thrilled with the clinic, with the results of my work. And now it's all gone to hell because of someone's meanness. She stopped and looked at me. Mitch, you were a prosecutor. Tell me, how do the feds find out about violations? Who tells them? It varies, I answered cautiously. Sometimes citizen complaints, sometimes IRS audits find discrepancies, sometimes anonymous calls. Anonymous calls, she exclaimed. That's it. Someone anonymously snitching on me. She grasped at this theory like a drowning man grasping at straws. But who? Who could know enough details about my business to give an accurate tip? Parrish raised his head. Clarice, maybe it's not about the tip-off. Maybe it really is a routine check. A routine check with search warrants? She snorted. Don't be ridiculous. She started studying the guest list again. There were too many strangers here, she said. I'd invited everyone I thought I needed to grow the business, but I hadn't considered that there might be enemies among them. Or people with principles, I added quietly. What? She turned to me sharply. Nothing. I shook my head. Just speculating. Clarice continued her investigation, calling people she knew, finding out who had talked to whom after the discovery, trying to find the source of the leaked information. Each conversation only made her more suspicious. It seemed to her that everyone around her was hiding something, not telling her, playing against her. I'll find that bastard, she promised, ending the call. And he'll be sorry he ever messed with me. Parrish looked tiredly at his wife. Clarice, maybe it would be better to focus on solving the problem instead of finding fault. A problem can only be solved by knowing its cause, she retorted. And the cause is that someone decided to destroy me. I watched her agony with growing satisfaction. Clarice was squirming in search of her enemy, unaware that he was right next to her. She was constructing conspiracy theories, blaming innocent people, but she couldn't even guess that the cause of her woes was her own words, spoken with such ease 2 days ago. Monday morning, John Harris called me at 8:30. I could hear in his voice a note of the professional excitement that comes over investigators when they come across something serious. Mitch, your intuition was golden, he said without preamble. What we found in the clinic's files was beyond our wildest expectations. That bad? I asked, settling into a chair with a cup of coffee. Worse. Your sister-in-law didn't just violate formalities. She created an entire fraud scheme. Forged certificates, illegal drugs, hiding her income, the whole package. I could feel my pulse racing. Of course, I expected to find some irregularities, but it was bigger than I thought. Tell me more. Let's start with the drugs. A good half of what she was using is either not certified in the U.S. at all or is only approved for experimental use in clinical trials, and the certifications she presented to her patients were high-quality fakes. Where did she get them from? According to the correspondence we found on her computer, she had a contact in Mexico. A Dr. Ramirez, who supplied her with both the drugs and the fake IDs. I imagined Clarice explaining the safety of the procedures to patients, showing them fake certificates and referring to European standards. How many people took her word for it, trusted her with their health? And what about taxes? Here is even more interesting. Officially, the clinic showed a modest income, about $15,000 a month. But in reality, she was making 3 times that amount. The difference was going into offshore bank accounts. Really? Pretty much. She had accounts at 2 banks in the Cayman Islands. The money was transferred there through shell companies that supposedly provided her with consulting services. I shook my head. Clarice was an even more sophisticated fraudster than I'd realized. She hadn't just used untested drugs, she'd created an entire financial scheme to avoid taxes. What's going to happen next, I asked. Today, the FBI guys will go back to her with more questions. And tomorrow, the IRS will begin an official audit of all her accounts, including offshore accounts. My guess is that within a week, criminal charges will be filed against her on several counts. Which ones? Fraud, tax evasion, unlawful practice of medicine, use of false documents. 10 to 15 years if they prove all the episodes. I finished my coffee and stood at the window. It was a normal Monday outside. People were hurrying to work, children were going to school, and somewhere at the same time my sister-in-law's life was being destroyed, and she didn't yet realize the magnitude of the disaster to come. Thank you, John. I appreciate your help. You're welcome. By the way, how's your family reacting to the inspections? My son's upset. My daughter-in-law's panicked. They still think it's a misunderstanding that can be resolved. Soon they'll realize it's not a misunderstanding. There's too much evidence to write it off as an accident. After my conversation with John, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about what I had heard. Clarice wasn't just an ambitious woman trying to build a career by any means necessary. She turned out to be a true criminal who deliberately defrauded patients in the state. Around noon, Parrish called. He sounded depressed. Dad, the agents came to the clinic again, this time with even more serious questions. Clarice says they're accusing her of using forged documents. Where is she now? At the clinic, answering questions. I can't be present for the questioning. They said it only concerns her as a business owner. I could hear the growing concern in my son's voice. He was beginning to realize that the situation was more serious than it initially seemed. Maybe I should come down here. I don't know. The agents said they'd contact the family if they needed to. So far, they're only working with Clarice. Okay, cell phone rings. Keep me posted. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Parrish called again. This time, he was on the verge of hysterics. Dad, it's really bad. Clarice admitted that some of the certificates were, wrong. The agents are talking about filing a criminal complaint. What do you mean wrong? She said some of the paperwork may have been irregular, but she swears she didn't know about it. She says they slipped her fakes and she trusted the supplier. Clarice was starting to get out of it, trying to blame it on others. The classic tactic of a crook who gets caught is to pretend to be a victim of fraud. What does she say about taxes? There's some problems there too. Agents found discrepancies in the returns. Clarice claims it's the accountant's fault for misfiling the paperwork. Of course, the accountant. Another convenient scapegoat. I wonder how many people Clarice is willing to frame to save herself. Parrish, I said cautiously, did you know about Clarice's business practices? What do you mean? There was a wary tone in my son's voice. Shikin, well, about the suppliers of drugs, about the financial schemes, about where the certificates come from. No, of course not, Parrish exclaimed. I only dealt with the administrative part. Renting premises, purchasing equipment, advertising. Medical matters were entirely Clarice's responsibility. I was relieved. My son really didn't know about my wife's machinations. He was an honest man who had been taken advantage of. It's a good thing you weren't involved, I said. Not involved in what? Parrish became wary. Dad, you make it sound like Clarice is really guilty of something serious. I'm not saying anything. I just want you to be prepared for any development. What kind of developments? His son's voice was becoming more and more anxious. Maybe the accusations will be more serious than they seem now. There was silence on the phone. Then Parrish said in a shaky voice, Do you think she really did something wrong? I think federal agents don't waste time on trivialities. In the evening, Clarice returned home in a state of near collapse. Parrish told me about it on the phone. She can barely stand on her feet, he reported. She says agents interrogated her for 6 hours, showed her documents, asked her questions about accounts, suppliers, everything. And what did she tell them? She keeps saying she was a victim of fraud, that she had been cheated by suppliers, that the accountant had incorrectly kept the accounts, that she herself knew nothing about the violations. And they believed her? Not likely. One of the agents bluntly said they had proof of her personal involvement in all the schemes. I pictured Clarice sitting in front of federal investigators, trying to play innocent, while they presented her with one piece of evidence after another. Correspondence with the suppliers of the forged certificates, documents about the opening of offshore accounts, records of money transfers, all with her personal signatures and orders. Peerish, I said. You need to think seriously about your position. What position? You are the husband of a man against whom a criminal case could be brought. It could affect you. But I didn't know anything. I didn't do anything. I understand that, but you're still going to need a lawyer. A good lawyer who specializes in federal cases. You think it's going to come to that? I think it's already started. Tuesday morning, things took a turn for the worse. John called me at 8 a.m. News, Mitch. And it's not good for your sister-in-law. Go ahead. Last night, the IRS froze all of her accounts, including her offshore accounts. And this morning, the FBI got an arrest warrant. Arrest? Yeah, charges of grand fraud and tax evasion. They're picking her up today, probably this afternoon. I felt my stomach clench. The arrest meant the case was irreversible. Clarice could no longer hope that everything would go away. What about the clinic? They're shutting it down until the investigation is complete. All equipment and drugs are being seized as evidence. I see. Mitch, I have to warn you. The investigation will be looking very closely at everyone associated with the clinic, including relatives. Meaning? Meaning your son may be called as a witness, or maybe not just as a witness, if they find evidence of his involvement in the schemes. Parrish didn't know anything, I said firmly. I hope you're right, but the investigation would have to prove it. After talking to John, I knew I had to warn Parrish of his impending arrest. But as soon as I dialed his number, the phone rang. It was my son. Dad, he sounded panicked. The agents are on their way. Clarice is in the bathroom, sobbing. She says it's over. Parrish, listen to me carefully, I said. Do not tell the agents anything unnecessary. Answer only direct questions and only the truth. But what can they ask? About what you knew about the clinic's business, your involvement in financial transactions, your contacts with suppliers. But I didn't know anything. Then say so, and get a lawyer if you feel the questions are getting too serious. Dad, Parrish's voice was shaking. What's going on? What have we gotten ourselves into? You haven't gotten into anything. Clarice did, and you just happened to be there. But even as I said those words, I knew how painful it would be for my son to learn the truth about the woman he had trusted with his love and his future. Parrish would not only have to survive the collapse of the family business, but also realize that the man he thought was his life partner turned out to be a cynical con man. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, news of Clarice's arrest spread throughout Mansfield. The local newspaper was already running a story about a high-profile case involving a doctor who had defrauded patients and evaded taxes. The clinic that 2 days ago had seemed a symbol of success and professionalism was now the subject of town gossip and a federal investigation. I sat in my office and thought about how quickly the world Clarice had built so carefully and methodically had crumbled. Just one phone call to an old friend had been enough to set in motion the machinery of justice that was now inexorably grinding down all her ambitions and plans. Parrish came to see me on Thursday evening, 3 days after Clarice's arrest. I saw him from the study window as he walked slowly down the path toward the house, slouching under the weight of his own thoughts. In those days, my son had aged several years. His face had grown gaunt, and his eyes had that peculiar emptiness that comes after too painful a discovery. I opened the door before he could ring the bell. We hugged in silence, and I could feel him shaking with nervous tension. "Come in," I said. "Can I get you anything?" "Whiskey if you have it," said Parrish, deftly. We went into the living room where I poured us both a glass. Parrish drank half of it in one gulp, grumbled, and set it down on the table. We sat in silence for a few minutes, each absorbed in his own thoughts. "The lawyer says the case against Clarice is ironclad," the son said at last. There's too much evidence to argue anything. The only thing we can hope for is a plea bargain. What about you? So far, I'm only being held as a witness. But my lawyer said that could change if they find evidence of my involvement in financial schemes. Pirish finished his whiskey and looked at me with an attentive look I hadn't seen from him in years. You know what the worst part is? He continued. Not the arrest, not the embarrassment, not the collapse of the business. It's what I realized. I didn't know the woman I'd lived with for 3 years at all. He stood up and started pacing the room, just as Clarice had done a few days ago at the clinic. All these months she'd been telling me one thing, but in reality she'd been doing something completely different. Forged certificates, offshore accounts, Mexican suppliers, I didn't suspect any of it. She wanted to protect you, I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Protect me? Pirish turned to me sharply. Dad, she was using me as a cover. I was a convenient screen for her machinations. An honest husband who knows nothing and suspects nothing. There was such bitterness in his voice that I felt sorry for him. My son had always been too trusting, too ready to see the best in people. Clarice had used that trait cruelly. I lived with a criminal for 3 years without noticing it, Parrish continued. Saran, what does that say about me? About my ability to understand people? It's not your fault she was a good liar. It wasn't? He stopped and looked at me with pain in his eyes. Dad, I've seen how she works with people, how she scrutinizes everyone, how she can steer conversations in the right direction. I marveled at her ability to get close to powerful people. Turns out it was the skills of a con artist. Parrish sat back in his chair and wrapped his arms around his head. You know what my lawyer told me? That people like me are called useful idiots. People who give respectability to criminal schemes without realizing it themselves. I listened to my son and felt a growing unease. Not because of what he'd said about Clarice. She really was what she turned out to be. It was the fact that Parrish was beginning to analyze the events of the last few months, which meant that sooner or later, he might wonder how the federal agencies had learned of the irregularities. Dad, he said, raising his head, can I ask you a strange question? Sure. Did you notice anything suspicious about Clarice's behavior? Did you have any doubts about the honesty of her business? The question I feared. Parrish was frustrated and angry, but his mind was working clearly. He was trying to figure out how he could have overlooked the obvious, and in the process of that analysis, he was able to pay attention to details he had previously ignored. There were some doubts, I answered cautiously, but I thought they were the usual issues of starting a new business. What kind of doubts? Well, for example, how quickly she'd made connections with influential people. Too focused, too calculating. Parrish nodded. Yes, I noticed that too, but I thought it was just business acumen. He was silent for a moment, clearly thinking about something. What else? I also wondered how she was introducing me at the opening of the clinic. How exactly? I knew I was getting to a dangerous point, but it was too late to back out. The way she talked about my participation in her experiments seemed to me disrespectful. Disrespectful? Parrish frowned. But she was thanking you, telling you how brave you were. She called me a lab rat. The words came out on their own. I hadn't planned to say them directly, but they came out, and now they hung in the air between us. Parrish blinked as if he didn't understand. What? At the opening of the clinic, when she introduced me to the guests, she said, "Meet my father-in-law and my first lab rat." That can't be right. Yes, it can. I remember every word perfectly. Parrish stood up and began pacing the room again, but now his movements were more abrupt, nervous. But everyone laughed, applauded. No one took it as an insult, because she made it sound like a joke, like a nice family story about a kind father-in-law helping his daughter-in-law work out the techniques. Oh my God, Parrish whispered. Did she really say that? She did, and she added that I was the perfect patient, that I allowed her to experiment, try different dosages, compare the effects of different drugs. Parrish stopped and looked at me with horror. Daddy, I'm sorry, I didn't know. I don't remember her saying that. You were happy, proud of her. You couldn't hear what you didn't want to hear. And you didn't say anything. What could I have said? Make a scene in the middle of the gala? Embarrass you in front of everyone you know? Parrish sank into a chair and covered his face with his hands. So you then you had already realized what she was? Not completely, but I realized that for her, I was not a relative, but a tool, a means to an end. And what did you do? The question I was most afraid of. Now that the conversation had gotten this far, I couldn't dodge the truth any longer. I called an old friend at the IRS, I said after a long pause. The silence in the room became deafening. Parrish slowly raised his head and looked at me. You what? I asked him to check if everything was in order with the clinic's paperwork. You, Parrish's voice trailed off. You snitched on your own sister-in-law? I asked him to check the legality of her activities. It's the same thing, the son exploded. You knew it would lead to checks, an investigation, possible arrest. I knew that if she was running an honest business, there would be no problems. And if she wasn't, then justice would be served. Parrish jumped up from his chair and began pacing the room furiously. Justice, he shouted. Dad, that's my wife, the mother of my future children, the man I loved. Surinam, the man who publicly humiliated your father and engaged in fraud. But you didn't know about the fraud when you called. You were avenging a personal grudge. That hit the target. Parrish was right. When I called John, it wasn't to seek justice, but to avenge a humiliation. The fact that Clarice had turned out to be the real culprit was a happy accident. Perhaps, I agreed, but it didn't change the outcome. The result? Parrish stopped in front of me. The result is that my wife is in jail, my business is ruined, and my family's reputation is tarnished. All because you couldn't swallow a bad joke. It wasn't a joke. It was a deliberate humiliation. Even if it was, is that any reason to ruin people's lives? I didn't ruin lives. I just let the truth come out. Parrish shook his head in disgust. You know what the worst part is? You're right about Clarice. She really did turn out to be a fraud. She really did take advantage of both of us. And her arrest is only fair. He paused and looked at me with pain in his eyes. But what you did was despicable. You avenged a personal grudge with lofty words about justice. And worst of all, you did it in secret from me. Parrish. No, Dad, let me finish. Clarice betrayed me as a wife by lying about her business, and you betrayed me as a father by not telling me your plans. You both thought you knew better than me what was good for me. He headed for the exit, but turned around on the threshold. I don't know what's worse, living with a criminal who cheats you or a father who betrays you. The door slammed shut, and I was alone in the living room with 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey. Dusk was falling outside the window, and the house was slowly falling into silence. I poured myself another whiskey and sat in the chair for a long time, thinking over my son's words. Parrish was right about many things. I had indeed acted out of personal motives, covering myself with noble goals. I had indeed failed to warn him of my plans, and I had indeed ruined his life, even if that life was built on lies. But I had no regrets. Clarice got what she deserved. And the fact that Parrish was hurt in the process, well, sometimes justice requires sacrifice, even if those sacrifices are their own children. I finished my whiskey and went upstairs. Tomorrow would be a new day, and I would have to learn to live with the consequences of my choices. 6 months later, I was sitting in the same chair in the living room, reading the morning paper. On page 3 was a small notice that former physician Clarice Dunhill Holmes had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud and tax evasion. The judge denied a defense motion for leniency, noting the cynical and elaborate nature of the criminal scheme. I carefully cut out the note and put it in a folder where other materials on the case were already lying. Over the course of 6 months, I had accumulated a lot of them. Articles in the local press, news programs, official court documents. The story of the rise and fall of the ambitious doctor had become one of the most talked about topics in Mansfield. The clinic on Main Street has long been closed. The building is being rented out, but so far there are few takers because of the reputation of the place. Sometimes when I drive by, I see the faded remnants of the Aesthetic Medicine Center sign and remember the night it all began. The grand opening, Clarice's speech, her words about me. It seems like it's been forever since that moment. John Harris recently retired, but we still meet occasionally for lunch. He never asked too many questions about what made me ask him to check out the clinic. His professional ethics prevented him from going into detail about the investigation, but from his hints I realized that the case against Clarice was one of the easiest of his career. The evidence was so abundant that the defense didn't even try to argue the facts, instead focusing on trying to mitigate the verdict. "Your sister-in-law turned out to be a real professional," he told me at the last luncheon. "Not in medicine, but in fraud. The scheme was elaborate, and yet she got caught because she got overconfident. She thought she could cheat the state and her patients with impunity. Overconfidence. Yes, that was Clarice's characteristic. She was used to manipulating people and getting her way, so she didn't think it was necessary to follow the laws that seemed to be an obstacle to her success. Parrish hasn't spoken to me in 4 months. After our last conversation, he tried to maintain a semblance of a normal relationship. He called on holidays, came over occasionally for dinner, but everything was strained and formal. And then, when Clarice agreed to a deal with the investigation and confessed to all the crimes, he finally distanced himself. The last time we spoke was in February, when he came to pick up some family belongings that were stored in my house. "I'm selling the house and moving to Austin," he informed me dryly, putting the photos in a box. "Why?" "There are too many memories here, and too many people who look at me as Clarice's accomplice. It wasn't fair, but it was understandable. In a small town, reputation is everything, and the Dunhill family name was now associated with scandal. Parrish was finding a new job in real estate and wanted a fresh start. Ishurnam, what about our relationship?" I asked. He stopped and looked at me with weariness in his eyes. "Dad, I can't forgive you for what you did. Not that you stopped Clarice. I'm grateful for that. It's the way you did it, in secret from me, out of personal revenge." Parrish, "No, let me finish. It took me 6 months to realize one thing. Clarice cheated on me for money and career, but at least she had selfish motives that I could understand. And you ruined my life for what? To punish a woman who made a bad joke? That's exactly what it was. And the worst part is, you still don't realize the magnitude of what you did. You're proud of yourself. You think you're a fighter for justice." Parrish closed the box and headed for the exit. "I don't want anything more to do with you. I'm sorry, but I can't." He hasn't been in touch since then. I know his new address in Austin, but I don't call or write. Parrish made his choice, and I have to respect it. Some evenings I sit on the porch with a glass of wine and think about how my life has changed over the year. The house is quieter and emptier without my son's regular visits. Family dinners on Sundays are a thing of the past. Holidays are spent alone. The neighbors are wary of me. Some think I did the right thing by stopping a criminal. Others condemn me for destroying my own family. Still others simply avoid unnecessary contact. Scandalous stories are contagious, and no one wants to be around them. My reputation has suffered, but not critically. After all, I was a victim of Clarice's fraud, not an accomplice. And my background as a federal prosecutor plays in my favor. Most people believe I acted out of principle, not personal animosity. But the amazing thing is that I have no regrets. Even after losing my relationship with my son, even after being left alone, I believe I did the right thing. Clarice got what she deserved. Justice was served. And if innocent people were hurt in the process, well, that's just the way it is. Yesterday, an old friend of mine, Judge Coleman, came to see me. We sat out on the porch drinking whiskey and talking about the latest news in town. "You know, Mitch," he said, "a lot of people think you're a hero, a man who wasn't afraid to fight corruption even in his own family. What do you think?" Coleman hesitated, twirling the glass in his hands. "I think you acted like a prosecutor, saw a violation of the law and took action. Personal motives don't matter. It's the result that counts. Horseshit, even if it destroyed a family, you didn't destroy the family. It was destroyed by a woman who thought she could break the law with impunity. Maybe he's right. Maybe I was really just doing my duty as a citizen, despite my personal relationships. But deep down inside, I know the truth. I did it out of revenge, and I don't hide it from myself." This morning, the mailman brought a letter with no return address. Inside was a clipping from an Austin newspaper announcing that Pirish Dunhill had married for the second time. The wedding was a modest, intimate affair. He looked happy in the picture. I looked at it for a long time, trying to see the face of my new daughter-in-law, a young woman with kind eyes and an open smile. I hope my son made the right choice this time. I don't know who sent this clipping. Perhaps a mutual friend thought I should know about an important event in my son's life. Perhaps it was Pirish himself, who, for all his resentment, still considers me family. I put the clipping in the same folder where the Clarice trial files are kept. Different stories, different outcomes, but all part of one big story. The story of how an ambitious woman decided to use the Dunhill family to achieve her goals, and what came of it. In the evening, I sat in an armchair, listened to classical music, and reflected on the past year. Did I have a choice when Clarice publicly humiliated me? Could I have swallowed the insult and pretended that nothing had happened? Theoretically, yes. Practically, no. I've lived too long to let someone trample on my dignity with impunity. Clarice made the mistake of underestimating a man she thought was weak and harmless. She thought she could use me as a tool to achieve her goals, and then dismiss me with disdain. One thing she didn't realize is that tools are sometimes sharper than they look. Now she sits in federal prison and reflects on her mistakes. She's got 8 years to figure out where she miscalculated. I have the rest of my life to live with the consequences of my choices. I don't regret what I did, and I'm not going to apologize to anyone, not Parish, not Clarice, not myself. Justice doesn't need apologies, and revenge needs no apology.